Introduce Corey, who is our speaker, and I should have a nice biography to read about him, but I don't have it with me, so we'll just go straight into it.
So a quick one. So I teach theology and philosophy at what's called a minor seminary down in Covington, Louisiana. So I teach Plato, Aristotle, modern metaphysics, that kind of stuff. Even though by training I'm a theologian, and I have enough philosophy in my background, I mainly teach philosophy to undergraduates. And I also do lots of work with the Science and Religion Initiative at the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. I'm a scholar associate for the Society of Catholic Scientists. And my wife Jennifer and I have 8 children. We live out in Covington in the country, do a little bit of Catholic school, a little bit of homeschool. It is very awesome for me to be with you tonight. So I'm glad you guys are here, and hope our time together was fruitful. Now, before I tell you what I'm going to talk about, I want to talk about a letter that Pope St. John Paul II wrote in 1988 to Father George Coyne. He was the then head of the Vatican Observatory. And the occasion of the letter was a series of study days marking the 300th anniversary of Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica. Now this letter, which was initially issued as an address, and the text of the address was actually altered by curial officials. So John Paul II decided to make it into a formal letter so that it couldn't be altered. My friend Chris Bagla, who actually runs the Science and Religion Initiative at McGrath, calls this letter something like a charter for the relation between Roman Catholic faith and the modern empirical scientific project. Now in this letter, Pope St. John Paul II talks about, or rather calls for what he calls critical openness and mutual engagement between religion and theology and the modern empirical scientific project based on the common human drive to know and understand the truth, the common longing and desire of the human spirit for love. And he describes this in terms of an ever-increasing relationship of unity. Now that sounds all very nice, but remember, the openness he describes between science and religion is a critical and thoughtful openness. And in the letter, he lays out certain contours of what this might look like. And this is from the letter, I quote, "By encouraging openness between the church and the scientific communities, we are not envisioning a disciplinary unity between theology and science like that which exists within a given scientific field or within theology proper. As dialogue and common searching continue, there will be growth towards mutual understanding and a gradual uncovering of common concerns, which will provide the basis for further research and discussion. Exactly what form that will take must be left to the future. What is important, as we have already stressed, is that the dialogue should continue and grow in depth and scope. In the process, we must overcome every regressive tendency to a unilateral reductionism, to fear, and to self-imposed isolation. What is critically important is that each discipline, theology and science, should continue to enrich, nourish, and challenge the other to be more fully what it can be, and to contribute to our vision of who we are and who we are becoming." And he further qualifies these remarks in this fashion. "Yet the unity that we seek is not identity. The Church does not propose that science should become religion or religion science. On the contrary, unity always presupposes the diversity and the integrity of its elements. Each of these members should become not less itself, but more itself in a dynamic interchange. For a unity in which one of the elements is reduced to the other is destructive, false in its promises of harmony, and ruinous of the integrity of its components. We are asked to become one. We are not asked to become each other." Now, much can be said about these remarks, but I will pick 2 things. First, The Holy Father's call is a call for mutual interchange, and an interchange can only be mutual if both parties in the interchange not only mutually understand one another, but mutually respect one another. So for this exchange to be mutual, any one party desiring a kind of a homogenization or a dominance or an absorption of the other would make the interchange no real interchange at all. He says again and again in the address that each discipline, this would go for any form of human inquiry by the way, has its own proper autonomy. We might say this bit of the cosmos or the reality, or reality at which it strives to gain understanding. Proper practices, methods, principles, rules of evidence, these kinds of things. And that any kind of mutual interchange is based upon an understanding of these principles and a mutual respect, and we'll say in a minute, admiration for the principles of the other. Now the second thing about this is interesting, is that such a project, however it might be, is essentially open-ended. It may have broad normative contours of mutual respect, dialogue, mutual interchange. But the practical shape this may take can never be determined in advance. So it has the character of an adventure. Because as soon as one determines in advance what the other is and all that the other can show, the other is essentially what? Reduced, not respected, kind of brought to the height, or brought down, right, to the level you might say. Now, one thing about this that I want to focus on tonight. So it seems to me that any project of mutual respect and interchange based off of that respect, something prior to this is required. Admiration and appreciation. So tonight, I have not come to do the following. So this is how this normally goes, by the way. I keep it in talks like this. So someone who is a theologian or a philosopher, or I might call myself a modern scholastic in the tradition, let's say, of St. Thomas. How these things normally go, and this is not bad. What somebody of my tribe might do is this. Lay out some kind of normative framework for the relation between philosophy, science, and theology. Might go on against the excesses of materialism and all of these kinds of things. Those are all valid talks to give and valid discussions to be had. But tonight I'm not going to do that. I've actually come to offer an appreciation and an admiration of what I'll call the scientific vocation. And offered from a theologian's, or let's say a kind of a modern scholastic's point of view. Now look, this is still part of the project of critical engagement. In the tradition, you might say, the intellectual tradition that I try to inhabit, we might call it the broadly scholastic one, the Aristotelian Thomistic one. The first move of criticism is not destructive skepticism. It is in fact wonder. I often think of Our Lady's response to the angel at the Annunciation. How can this be? The response of how this can be, or how can this be, is in response to something in the object one is analyzing or beholding that incites questions. Questions breed wonder, and wonder should terminate in something like an admiration for the thing one. So that's what I want to do tonight. And briefly, so if my talk, which is not thesis-driven, by the way, I'm not making an argument, but if it could be said to have an argument, the argument would be something like this. That the scientific vocation, namely, a commitment to a form of inquiry which seeks to understand nature, the cosmos, and the various facets of nature and the cosmos, in terms of their empirical and quantifiable aspects, that such a commitment to such inquiry plays a crucial, and I will eventually say sacred role, in what I'll talk about as a sacramental cosmos and a sacramental creation. So we'll do this in three broad steps. So first, I'm going to lay out, I'll be a bit of a scholastic for you all, by the way. So I'm going to lay out first sort of a mini course, and it'll be a very mini course, we won't be here all night. on how St. Thomas Aquinas sees what we might call divine action or divine agency, particularly relative to the created order, and what we'll call the difference in the relation between God's primary creative causality and creaturely causality. Then we'll move to a second part, but this in hand, we'll talk about how this implies what I'll call a sacramental cosmos. And a sacramental cosmos in which taking creatures seriously, taking nature and the cosmos seriously on its own terms and for its own sake is a crucial Christian posture. And this will be what I'll say is really the genius and one of the most wonderful things about the scientific vocation. And then finally, third, and maybe I'll give a few examples along the way, maybe some ways to approach how science in different factions, different ways actually does this. And then finally, I'll offer a couple of brief reflections, how from my perspective as a scholastic and one of the theologians, with air quotes, right, a theologian, how the scientific vocation, in many ways, is not only useful for theology, but in many ways is becoming indispensable for doing theology in certain questions in certain kinds of ways. All right? So let's begin, man. So here we go. So this is going to be St. Thomas on primary and secondary causality. And this is a word that's a bit off script for a second. In the way we tend to think through problems about the relation between the supernatural and the divine with the created order in creatures, very often a mistake made in this regard has tremendous implications, and if it's a mistake, most of them bad, for the way one can perceive how God takes to the world and how the world approaches God. Oftentimes, we tend to think in the following fashion. If certain phenomenon or state of affairs can be explained adequately in terms of other natural or creaturely causes, God is doing nothing. And that if some other kind of state of affairs, natural phenomenon, any phenomenon whatsoever, is explained in terms of divine action, then creatures are doing nothing. We tend to model, and it's almost instinctual in an odd way, model creaturely causality and divine causality as competing. According to Aquinas, which I think here in our tradition is our tradition at its best, nothing could be farther from the truth. So first, when God does anything, what does God do? Well, for Aquinas, what God does is, of course, everything, but he does everything by an act that Aquinas calls creation. Creation as an uncreated divine activity, which Aquinas intentionally contrasts with something he'll call change. This will encapsulate what creatures do. One thing acting upon another, imparting or moving some other creature to take some other new state of being or perfection, to enter some new state. Aquinas says, quote, "For creation is not change, but the very dependency of the created act of being upon the principle from which it is produced. And thus creation is a kind of relation, so that nothing prevents its being in the creature as in his subject." Translation: creation is just the radical dependency of every creature on God at every moment that it is, for what it is, and for all of its activities, insofar as it acts, always when it acts. It is a vertical, uncreated, originary, sustaining divine act by which every creature is what it is capable of acting, and acts in any way that it acts. It is immediate, simultaneous, and as long as a creature is in being and acts, is perpetual and sustaining. Now, this is what Aquinas means by creation ex nihilo, from nothing. This perpetual, radical, relation of dependency of a creature upon God as sustaining cause. Thomas says, I quote, "But just as God has not only given being to things, existence, when they first began to exist, but also causes being in them as long as they exist, conserves things in being, as we have shown, so also has he not merely granted operative powers," this is his word for action and causality, "to them when they are originally created, but he always causes these powers in things. Hence, if this divine influence were to cease, every operation would cease. Therefore, every operation of a thing is traced back to him, ultimately, as its cause." On Aquinas' account, by the way, this relation of dependency is irrelevant on the axis of time. If the cosmos were eternal, it would be no less dependent on God's created causal activity. Now, you might think of it this way, so as a thought experiment. Think of, let's say, a lamp, and a lamp is illuminating a sheet of paper in a void, whatever. And it has been illuminating this sheet of paper from and for all eternity. This state of lamp illuminating paper has had no beginning and will have no end. Now, notice the way Aquinas might see this. That the paper is illuminated, it eternally depends on the causality of the lamp. So that it is eternal makes it no less dependent. Aquinas, of course, believes the universe has a beginning, but it's a matter of Christian faith, not a matter of strict philosophical proof. And this is an interesting way that can forestall lots of errors. So let's say you and I could get into a time bubble. And let's just go a little science fiction, and those of you who are physicists, just please indulge me. So we get into our time bubble, and we set the dial for t equals 0, okay? You know what I'm talking about. So we set it for t equals 0. So now we are witnessing the singularity. And you like this. Some of you are about to fall on over and faint right now. Aquinas would say, what you and I see is no more or less creation than what you and I see at this moment. It is no more or less creation than this moment or any other moment in the cosmos. What we witness is the origins of one being, states of being, changing other states of being. It is no more or less dependent on God's primary causal activity than me giving this talk right now. In other words, God creates the cosmos ex nihilo. At every moment the cosmos is. Now, what do creatures do? Well, Aquinas' answer is almost everything. The almost is only for certain cases of miracle, by the way. Practically speaking, for our purposes, it is everything. He describes it in his own register as change. One creature imparting its causality and influence upon another. That now produces, you might say, another state of affairs or a new and different state of being. For Aquinas, everything intracosmic, and even things like angels, all they do is change. They move already existent beings into new states of being. This activity of change, you might think of on a horizontal axis. Aquinas says that would be the axis of secondary causes, the causality of creatures. Every moment of this axis is perpetually caused, capacitated by God's primary, vertical, you might say, causal activity. This is why St. Thomas calls God the causality of all causes, or the cause of all causality. In this regard, notice, divine uncreated causality and creaturely created causality are on two different axes. They are two radically different kinds. One the deep reason, the other the dependent on the deep reason. They are non-competing in principle. In principle. The idea that they could compete in this regard would be to misunderstand the terms and the concepts as they are used. In other words, it is never a case, save for certain instances and kinds of the miraculous, that if a creature does it, God doesn't do it. For Aquinas, every time a creature does it, God also does it, each in their own mode and in their own way. God sustaining and causing at every moment the causality of creatures. He puts it this way. It is also apparent that the same effect is not attributed to a natural cause and to divine power in such a way that it is partly done by God and partly by the natural agent. He means the creature that cause. Rather, it is wholly done by both, according to a different way. Just as the same effect is wholly attributed to the instrument and also wholly to the principal agent. You might say, who's hammering the nail, me or the hammer? That kind of thing. Everything that happens in the cosmos is on the horizontal plane, done by the causality of creatures. And in the vertical plane, you might say, that causality is deeply caused at every moment by God in two radically different ways. It is never a case of the creature or God. It is always a case of both. Now, this will imply, and you'll see this in a second in my encomium of praise for the scientific vocation, when you explain a creaturely matter in terms of creaturely causes, since creatures are real causes with their own integrity, this is exactly how you should explain creatures. If one has a question about nature, as nature, what counts as an explanation is an explanation in terms of nature. This is the idea. But wait, there's more. Furthermore, now to part 3. Almost on the cusp of part 3. If God is the cause of all causality, this is how Aquinas thinks of how creation bears witness to God as creator. He talks about it in terms of likeness. If God is the cause of all causality, then creatures most image God and manifest the divine insofar as they influence and act as part of the ensemble of nature to other creatures. He says it this way. Therefore, if he, the Lord, has communicated his likeness as far as actual being is concerned to other things, by virtue of the fact that he has brought things into being, it follows that he has communicated to them his likeness as far as acting is concerned, so that created things may also have their own actions. So to detract from the perfection of creatures is to detract from the perfection of divine power. To devalue the causality of creatures is to devalue and dishonor God. The more you can explain in terms of creatures' natural causes, that is not to the detriment, but to the exaltation of divine power and majesty. In other words, you could flip the thing on its head. The more active a creature, and the more a creature does, you might say in a certain fashion, the more active and the more God is doing in sustaining and causing this creature to be a cause. This idea of likeness, this is what you might say is the link between the divine and creation. Creatures are, and they manifest their likeness to God, how they reflect divine perfection, primarily insofar as they are causes, as they're active influences to other beings in the ensemble that is nature. This, I think, is one of the main contributions that the scientific vocation can actually give to the human vocation. among all the things for which the human being is meant in Aquinas, and of course the main thing human beings are meant for is to see God. You might say one of our auxiliary purposes, this side of the vision of God, is to take the cosmos into us as known. And as far as Aquinas knows, we're the only intracosmic creature who can accomplish such a feat. That how can creation be returned to God? For Aquinas, and one way we can do this is in knowledge. One of my favorite Thomists, Charles de Connick, calls it taking a tour of being. And how do we return the cosmos to God? In part, by taking a tour of being. Now, therefore, all creatures have causality, are part of the ensemble, have some sort of influence in the ensemble that is nature. Every single bit of created reality is therefore a finite created reflection or likeness of the uncreated perfection that is God. Every creature we can see or detect or know in any way whatsoever bears a trace of the uncreated causality, which of course we cannot see. For those of us who have eyes, every creature and facet of a creature, whether we can detect this or not, by the way, is a carrier of divine meaning. You might call it a kind of natural, not divine, but natural revelation. Every creature is a carrier of divine meaning. We also have carriers of divine meanings in our lives. I'll pick 7 of them. The sacraments. If this is the case, every creaturely reality is fundamentally sacramental in a certain analogous way. Is a visible, detectable, or we'll just say created, carrier of divine meaning, and possibly some sort of encounter. And just like the salvific sacraments, the sacraments of the church, which are all created signs, that the created vehicle of divine meaning maintain its integrity as a creature is crucial. Now follow. With no water, baptismal regeneration does not happen. With no water, not 5W30. I'm thinking about I have a diesel truck, Rotella T6, 15W40. Fruit juice, water. The Eucharistic true presence of Christ only obtains and only lasts as long as the accidents of bread and wine remain. If the way God takes to the world is a sacramental way, and the incarnation of the Son of God definitively shows this, then the integrity of the creaturely sign, or the creaturely carrier, is crucial, because there is no encounter with God without the creature. So, theologian hat for a minute. It's only when we touch the Son of God as man do we have access to the divine. We all understand this, correct? Only if we touch Jesus as man, we have a salvific encounter with Christ. God takes to the world in and through, never in spite of, the humanity of Jesus. In the natural world, in the plane of not grace but nature, God only takes to the world through creatures. Aquinas is serious. The human cognitive and existential apparatus is a bodily one. It is fundamentally an empirical one. And this side of the vision of God, we are bound by it, and we are bound by it, save if once. He says it's raptus, which would be like St. Paul or Moses seeing the vision of God in his life. That would be the only exception to that order. Now, what does this have to do with the scientific vocation? It has everything to do with the scientific vocation, to my mind. It seems to me that one of the things the scientific vocation does, as I define it, is it attests to the integrity of creation. Here considered as creation that's intracosmic, nature, the cosmos. To study creation, to study creatures, to study nature, on its own terms as a creature. A nucleotide, a quark, a quasar. We could go on and on. Whatever your creatures of choice are, or whatever your discipline, your bit of inquiry that has captured your imagination and your heart. This does not, and if properly understood, cannot detract from divine majesty, but can only enhance it. The more one explains in terms of secondary creaturely causes, the more one attests to the grandeur and uncreated power that is simultaneously and perpetually causing this creaturely causality. That creaturely causes, modeled in a way that is selectively empirical and quantifiable. The closer you get to physics, the more the language becomes mathematical. This would go for either observational or experimental sorts of science. Is no mark against the scientific vocation in its modern construal. And that its methodology and explanations follow those contours of the empirical, the quantification, broadly considered, broadly speaking. But it's part of the service that it bears to human beings taking a tour of being. So even that the scientific vocation is uncompromisingly, in a certain way, naturalistic in its explanations and its quest, is also no bad thing. It is in fact a good thing, because it is attesting to the intelligibility and the causality of creatures. That it only deals, you might say, or I might say as a Thomism, scholastic, with the outside of things, as if that's a small thing. Say the empirical and metrical aspects of reality. This is a good thing. Remember, reality is sacramental. This is no place for an argument that things have an inside. This is no place for that argument. Things have deep natures and essences and this sort of talk. But the only way you get to the inside is through the external. Things in the world manifest their being. They manifest their being by how they present themselves to us in act. The scientific vocation focuses in on that. It is a guide, part of the many guides we have in all kinds of fields of human inquiry, to tell us what things are and what they are as causes of a certain kind. Even though the model is of a certain model, right? Possibly mechanistic, depending on how one looks at these things. It is telling us something about creatures as causes. It is telling something about the author of their causality. That science is somehow methodologically narrow. What field of inquiry isn't? This is no more. That just describes any particular field of inquiry. Reality in the cosmos is multifaceted, depending on your question and your interest. Certain methods work and certain don't. To take a method is to make a model, is to pretend it's only this rather than these other things. There's no form of human inquiry that doesn't work that way. Even theology. By the way, even theology. So that, let's say in physics, so I'm thinking of certain conversations I've had with friends who are in theoretical physics. So whenever reality in the more fundamental levels in terms of physics, reality is being described, its language is inevitably mathematical. So there's a wonderful line in a film I'd seen a couple of years ago. A guy's in the physics department, he's teaching a student, and the student's making bad grades. And they were talking about Schrodinger's cat, and there's also this kind of blackboard wall full of equations. And the student says, but I understand about the cat. He says, but you don't understand the math. And if you don't understand the math, you don't understand the physics. Right? It's like you're trying to read a Latin text and not knowing Latin. Well, okay, look. That the deep structures of the cosmos are mathematical. And, if one is a secret mathematical Platonist like me, ideal. This is a marvelous and marvelous thing and service to the world. There is no result, there is no bit of data in this regard that is insignificant, that doesn't uncover in some significant way, whether that data has to do with sort of larger structures and behavior patterns of organisms and biology, or if one is into this, their biochemistry alone. Even if a psychometrician is crunching correlational coefficients, this is telling us something, in this case, about some facet of what it means to be human, and a human kind of cause. Sometimes good, sometimes not so good, by the way, as human types of causes go. This to me is a marvelous, marvelous thing. Now, if this is the case, then finally, we go to our third part. It seems to me, and this will be very little use to you, but is of large use to people of my tribe, that I really do think that every facet, and this would differ as case to case and discipline to discipline, problem to problem, but that the scientific vocation as such is at the very least, exceedingly helpful to theologians, and at the most, depending on one's questions, utterly indispensable. And this is someone who's also a philosophy guy, by the way. So classically understood, some of you have heard this talk before, that the Ancilla Theologiae, the handmaid of theology, is classically speaking philosophy. Really, in the period in which these kinds of thoughts are enunciated, they would have called what you did, and what some of you do, philosophy. The idea is that human rational inquiry, and maybe preeminently philosophy, and that's another argument for another time, is the handmaid of theology. Now look, this handmaid business is often misunderstood. So sometimes you'll get a triumphalistic sort of narrative. Theology is the queen of the sciences and all of these other things that are handmaids. Queens have handmaids for multiple reasons. Okay? They have handmaids for multiple reasons. Sometimes they have handmaids because they need them. It may be, in a certain regard, theology is the queen of the sciences because she is in some ways the most dependent. So let me read a text to you from Aquinas that you will be tempted to take one way, but there is a better way to read it. This is from the Summa. And it's about the question, what is the relation to other forms of human inquiry? He would say sciences, to theology. Now, a little background. Aquinas thinks that theology, this kind of systematic understanding of divine revelation, is ultimately based on what he calls the science. He means comprehensive knowledge that God has of himself and that the blessed have of God as they seek God. So have this in the background. He thinks this is ultimately where divine revelation obviously comes from. He says this. This science, he means theology, can in a sense depend upon the philosophical sciences. Let's just think of human rational inquiry, and we're talking about here the empirical scientific enterprise. Not as though it stood in need of them, oh, but we'll see, that's not true, but only in order to make its teaching clearer. What does he mean? For it, he means theology, ultimately he means faith in divine revelation, accepts its principles not from other sciences, but immediately from God by revelation. So the data of the theologian, in other words, is revealed, is not something for which he has to go out and search, or derivative from some other field of inquiry, right? Therefore, it does not depend on other sciences as upon the higher, but makes use of them, he says, as of the lesser, as handmaids. Here we go. That it thus uses them is not due to its own defect or insufficiency. Here he means divine revelation is of itself not insufficient. But, he says, but to the defect of our intelligence, which is more easily led by what is known through natural reason to that which is above reason. The claim is that divine revelation doesn't need to be justified. There's nothing deficient in it. But if one wants to do theology, as in encounter and explain divine revelation, We have a problem. Because by nature, we are led to what is more easily known, starting there, to what is more difficult to know. It's just a sheer matter of learning. In other words, for Aquinas, the theologian cannot do without philosophy or human rational inquiry, because he's a human being. Because he's a human being. So there's this kind of secret way, which is not often talked about enough. Theology is in desperate need of human rational inquiry. Because we're the ones doing the theologizing. We're the ones reflecting on faith. Now, there's another way it might need it. And this is just something maybe for you to think about. If we were to go rehearse this as a class, if we would say, what is the ultimate sort of source of God's divine revelation? We would eventually, after a painful Q&A, the what color is the professor thinking of game, right? We would narrow it down. It's Jesus. The only access we have to Christ is in and through a creature, is humanity. The words of sacred Scripture are created. Do you see? Divine revelation is delivered sacramentally. In every case. In every case. So that to understand creatures, to understand it, is indispensable, is of the utmost importance. And I'll close with just a couple of general examples. So somebody might say, well, what does the modern scientific enterprise do for theology? Well, according to Pope St. John Paul II, in his letter to George Coyne, he says, well, first, theology can protect the scientific vocation from, he says, quote, false absolutes. His idea is that theology, divine revelation, can provide a sort of a larger or a wider perspective. That's not reductive. That doesn't interest me here with you guys. That's another talk for another time. But then he says in the next sentence, in the next clause of the same sentence, science can purify religion from superstition and error. And you might say, how does it do that? It does it all of the time and with increasing frequency. And by purify from superstition and error, he's getting at, I would think, something like this, that it forces somebody like the theologian to begin to sort of focus on what is truly the matter of faith and theological, and not auxiliary concerns. So I'll give you two examples, one historical, one forward-looking. So you guys have probably some passing familiarity with the Galileo affair. So we have this big to-do about many issues, one of which is a scripture like Joshua 10, verse 13, about the Lord stopping the sun and all the celestial mechanics around the earth to lengthen the day. By the way, there are many biblical passages that are much more explicitly geostatic and geocentric than that passage, like crystal clear. So, we obviously, for a set of reasons not important now, don't read those passages as asserting as a matter of divine revelation either geocentrism or geostaticism. We don't read them this way now because of something internal to the biblical text. There is no reason internal to those texts that one would come to the conclusion that they're saying something different. We only read those texts differently because of science. Because it has been shown, look man, this is just the nature of the cosmos in this regard. And we have a commitment that the truth is unified, and whatever the Lord is saying, he's not saying something contrary to this because we know it to be the case. It is only essentially because of an extra theological series of discoveries that anyone thought, and this is just not arbitrary, thought to read them differently. Even prior to the Galileo affair, St. Augustine, in his literal commentary on the book of Genesis, is very cautious in these regards because of what he takes to be the finding of human reason in terms of pagan astronomy and natural philosophy to be. So, before we say the biblical text says X, We're going to make sure that it doesn't contradict what we know from reason alone. This and things like it have been a tremendous service to not only approaching Scripture, but to theologically thinking about what is going on in divine revelation. I could multiply examples, by the way. Here's an example going forward, of which I will be purposefully very general. So if a geneticist tells me that there is a mathematical minimum of breeding pairs to account for the genetic diversity in the human population as it stands today, and that mathematical minimum, most probably in actual minimums, is anywhere from 8 to 10,000. Whatever this data means, and whatever it may connect to other things, as a theologian who thinks about human origins, and who's trying to think about human origins in a way that is faithful to what the Church teaches and to dogmatic tradition, I must take this into account. Do you see? I have no choice. To not do so is irresponsible. Utterly irresponsible. This, and actually whole sorts of findings in paleontology, all kinds of things. Like, this data cannot be ignored. So when I'm thinking through what divine revelation implies, or even the Church's dogmatic tradition, I can't ignore it. There is a way in which, to close, someone can do really good work, and let's say plasma physics, I don't know. Can do really good work in plasma physics. Do it well according to the standards internal to it as a form of human inquiry and a discipline. And really not give a whole lot of thought to the larger picture, do you see? What does it all mean? Divine revelation, these sorts of things. That can offer him a wider perspective, maybe, and to see his work and other things. But he can do his work competently, without me, let's say. I'm here to tell you, depending on what one's working on, I can't do my work competently without you. Now, Pope St. John Paul II actually ends his address with wondering if people of my tribe will essentially engage with what I've been calling scientific practice and vocation, modeled in the way that St. Thomas did with Aristotle in the Middle Ages. And he puts it this way: the matter is urgent. Contemporary developments in science challenge theology far more deeply than did the introduction of Aristotle into Western Europe in the 13th century, which by, you might say, the criteria of that time was seemingly the best that human reason had to offer. Yet these developments also offer to theology a potentially important resource. Just as Aristotelian philosophy, through the ministry of such great scholars as St. Thomas Aquinas, ultimately came to shape some of the most profound expressions of theological doctrine. So can we not hope that the sciences of today, along with all forms of human knowing, may invigorate and inform those parts of the theological enterprise that bear on the relation of nature, humanity, and God? Question mark. For this question to be answered, the adventure essentially has to begin. An open-ended one. And, well, every once in a while you do get stories where sometimes the telling is just as good as the ending. I sincerely hope and pray that this will be one of those stories. So look, to conclude. You might say I've come today not to, thinking of Julius Caesar, Shakespeare, I've come here not to critique the science vocation, but to praise it. And I am with this. So look, and this goes for anyone who works in an applied field. I've always marveled, and this is actually a bit of Father testimony personally. I've always marveled. So there's a libel that sometimes my tribe would give to the scientific vocation. And they will talk about scientists as if they have no wonder or interest in nature as such, but only for results or practical applications, as if that were a bad thing itself. I've never met a scientist in an applied field who wasn't actually filled with wonder for nature as such. That work is not only no small thing, I want you to know it's a great thing from the theologian's perspective. It may on one level be mundane work and seemingly a mundane vocation about mundane things. If everything in its causality is a likeness of God, it's sacred work, and it's sacred work about holy things. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for listening.
Any questions from the group before we
Yeah, sure.
start some desserts? Ask away.
Yeah, again, Tim Cook, thank you very much. It was very thoughtful. I had two questions.
Sure. I'll do my best.
I like that at the end when you talked about theology. I wrote down theology can protect science from the dark side.
And so can good philosophy too, by the way. That's not theology's experience.
You know, one of the things in my work is I encountered is there's actually work going on about how to genetically modify human beings for space travel, which I think is not. I think theology needs to weigh in there.
We just hope they would listen if we did.
I'm sorry.
We just hope somebody would listen if we did, anyway.
And then, of course, the Galileo affair about science, purifying religion from superstition error. Does that last point mean that you don't, do you or do you not believe in intelligent design?
Oh, is it? Okay. I'll put it this way. Actually, there's some other things in my talk that this is that question too. So is your question about certain kinds of arguments, or that the cosmos is intelligently designed?
Well,
Because the latter, I obviously believe, and for a certain set of reasons. Okay, so I'm going to answer that question this way. Any argument that's an intelligent design argument would have to be adjudicated on its own merits. So I don't want to paint a brush so broad. I'll just say it this way. Any argument that does this, and I'm saying this as in a lot of them I've encountered do this, any argument that concedes that in some cases creation is a closed system into which God must insert himself miraculously to achieve natural results, I think concedes a bad model of the cosmos and creation in order to make an argument I would ultimately, the conclusion I would agree with. In other words, it seems to be like this. There are certain features of nature that can be explained reductively and certain that can't. From my perspective, there is no feature of nature that could be explained reductively. Do you see? So, yeah, I think there are certain design arguments. So not to adjudicate them all. The ones I would, let's say, I would not like would be anyone that would make the mistake about primary and secondary causality that I would want them to avoid. Okay. And many I've seen do in fact do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Large majority, in fact, for whatever that's worth.
The second one, the math, which is something I think a lot about. Having read Wigner's paper on why mathematics should exist and why it's so useful and what does it mean, I think I'm there with you on being a Platonist. Is math a creature?
I was thinking the same question.
Okay, sure.
Okay. You might ask it, sure.
Okay,
I was just
yeah,
thinking.
so in this idiom, no, that's a perfectly good question. So in I guess you might say the idiom with the language I'm using, creature would denote, imagine you had a ledger. This is going to sound silly. You got the God side of the ledger, you got the not God side of the ledger. Everything and the proper thing would be like, God's the reason for the ledger. Let me do this. God. Right, of course, right, that would be correct. Like, God's not, because you don't want to ever have God and creatures in the same field of comparison. God's not like a super creature, you know what I mean? He's not Zeus, which is a main misconstrual of lots of folks. Okay, so there's the not God side of the ledger. Anything on the not God side of the ledger would fall in the creature category. Now, if we were to make more subtle distinctions, it may be that you can think of even facets of creatures in some way as let's just have it created realities. That sounds better. So now, it would be philosophically a question for me as someone who finds the idea of logical laws, mathematical entities of all sorts, as having reality and not just mental reality, but having some sort of objective ideal reality. The question would be, okay, well, are they these kind of objects, or are we really just looking at sort of deep governing structural realities that kind of reflect God's mind? Do you see what I mean? Most people in the Christian tradition tend toward the latter. But no, I do think, those of you who are really into math, read Plato's Timaeus. Read Timaeus. It's utterly fascinating. Every physically instantiated creature is ultimately composed of geometric entities, mathematical entities. And he has this idea that the deep structure of physical reality, because one has a choice to make. If you give me a second, one has a choice to make. I think of quaternions, if some of you know what that is. It's described as spin of electron. So it initially is thought up just because it's beautiful. It's an equation. I can't remember the guy's an Englishman who created, who basically, I would say discovered it. And he's asked at a party once, Sir such and such, I think it's Hamilton, something Hamilton. What are quaternions useful for? And he's like, madam, they're useful for solving problems that involved quaternions. So he does kind of, as in they were just beautiful. So this is going to sound, I'm really a blue collar guy from Louisiana, so I can get unprofessorial for a second. So it's like, you're going to tell me that this mathematical structure, discovered, I would say discovered, that kind of begs the question, discovered, just so happens to be the perfect tool to describe in certain conditions the spin of an electron. That's just some kind of, you follow what I mean? Yeah. That's just some kind of, that's a point where we fundamentally are so disagreeable in first principles and possibly intuitions, we should really talk about football. You see what I mean? Yeah, no, things like this. Yeah, no, so fundamentally, there are larger arguments about the laws of logic that incapacitate thought, but anyway, that's enough of that. Is that helpful? So it's a creature in a sense that it's part of the governing feature of creatures, but then is it a creature in the sense of an entity, like a Platonic entity? I don't know. I'm still actually trying to work that, like how, because the Christian tradition has wanted to not think of it in that regard, but just as this kind of structural trace of the divine mind in things. So, the God of the mathematician trope, which is all over the Middle Ages, by the way. All over the Middle Ages. Oh, that's all. Yes, ma'am.
We need to sleep.
Oh, you could have let me what I was talking about. Tell people, only my wife can hurt my feelings. Check out.
Just a comment. Your thesis really concentrates on the dependence of theology on the philosophies.
Yeah, which is part of the rhetoric of the occasion, by the way.
There's a companion thought about this because the sciences are not just a body of knowledge, but a discipline that goes with it, and that discipline requires a moral framework for pursuing the subject well.
Agreed, sure.
And so there's an inverse.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so how the rhetorical sausage is made. So yeah, of course, that's perfectly, yeah, but rhetorically part of the occasion was to move those things aside. And even, there are larger issues about, we could debate in whatever, quote, scientific rationality consists, but it's always a rationality that has kind of a place, because in other words, no human being could engage in that form of rationality for every purpose all the time, even interpreting data, by the way. Yeah, even standing back from a data set and what things may or may not mean usually involves other ways of thinking. You follow what I mean? Involves other frameworks and other ways of thinking. This is just to say that any kind of reductionism could never be consistently thoroughgoing. it would eventually sort of evacuate the very legs you would stand on to make claims in your practice. But again, that's another talk. But no, you're absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely right. Somebody else have their hand up? Yes, ma'am.
This might be too long. Well, anyway. You said that basically, like, anytime any creature or anything of the world does anything, God is acting too, right? They're both kind of...
God is capacitating at every moment the causality of that creature.
So what about when people do evil things? Like, where's the devil in this?
Even human freedom. So let's even a prior question that may be helpful. So even in this regard, human freedom is caused. It is a creature, and it is capacitated and caused by God.
Mm-hmm.
So understand that. So even creaturely, which is a temporally active freedom, right? So one thing you don't want to think of is, let's say, if you would think of creation in terms of an alpha and omega, like a geometric segment, if you want to think of time this way, and maybe it's going to do this and come back, whatever. But so think of time this way. Don't think of the uncreated as something prior, but rather something surrounding.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So that even when free creatures, which is the only kind of creatures can, do evil, that is caused in the sense of capacitated. At every moment the evil is done by the primary cause. You wouldn't exist.
Right.
So when I was in confirmation class, and not really caring about a whole lot, but I never forgot this. Deacon Rodless Lilla, so where I'm from, so my grandparents were native French speakers. So everybody talks with what you call a Cajun accent. I won't get too thick into it, but I remember him telling us, if God stopped thinking about you for 1 second, you would disappear. And I was like, dude, he's absolutely right. Like this is the idea. The causality is withdrawn, but it sustains the creature in being. So in that regard, yes, even perversions of human freedom are causally capacitated at every moment by God.
Right.
So that's one thing.
Yeah.
So what was the other part?
Oh no, I was just going to say, I guess I've always thought of it of like, well, we have free will as humans that was given to us by God, so we have the choice to choose good or evil, right? And so like, I've always thought of it as like God permits or allows sometimes us to do evil or to choose, whatever.
Sure.
I didn't know if that was contrary to what you were suggesting.
It's a certain way of packaging it. But that is not to say, so even in that regard, primary and secondary causality are non-competing. So even when a free creature perverts its will by its own causality, God capacitates that causality. So you follow me? It's not like God withdraws his causality and you do evil because you wouldn't exist. So even